Good day everyone. So why won't Genshin Impact release stronger 4 stars? Since in Azuma we've really been getting a lot of characters that feel very niche. They feel as though they do have a place in the game, but that place is not as universal as some of the OG 4-star characters like Bennet, Xingqiu, Xiangling, Fischl and Sucrose. And the question is, will Hoyo ever release stronger 4 stars? And well, I think we all know the answer, no. But there's a couple of reasons why I think people are kind of missing out as to why this is the case. So let's just go through a couple of the reasons, and hopefully these will be like new reasons that other content creators haven't really covered or sort of thought about. And I think one of the biggest reasons is the fact that Genshin Impact has a very complicated combat system. So when the game was released and like designed and so on, you obviously had to have units that can effectively test out the sort of extent of this combat system. So in other words, let's think of a character like Xingqiu. What do you as a developer get by designing a character with an overbloated kit like him? Well, there are a couple of things you can test. You can test like the ability to add like to shred an opponent's hydro resistance, to the ability for you to give like a hydro damage bonus to your character. You can test stuff like damage reduction. You can test stuff like how projectiles should move whenever a character triggers the normal attack animation. There's quite a lot in Xingqiu's kit, and I mean this is not even the full extent of it, that will give you so much like valuable combat data, and obviously then you can like fine-tune your game and so on, like for the future and so forth. But this doesn't explain characters, for instance, like Xiangling, that's got arguably a much simpler kit. And I think in her case, if you really understand like how the maths and Genshin Impact and so on works, she's a very good example of premature optimization. Basically, Xiangling can snapshot. I think everyone is sort of familiar with that term, attack buffs and so on. But what actually happens behind the scenes when she sort of like snapshots this? Well, basically, whenever you hit or Xiangling's Pyronado hits like a bunch of enemies in the game, essentially the game doesn't have to go and look up Xiangling's stats at that point in time. So it basically just like reads off of stats off of like a sort of, you almost think of it like static table. And when you have multiple enemies that you are sort of triggering reactions and you're doing all sorts of crazy things, it is actually way more efficient to have these stats sort of in a table that you can just sort of read as a game, instead of like having to constantly query it. So this is, I think, one of the very early examples of snapshotting that they've tested in the game, or I would at least make that bet that they've sort of tried to do that. And I think they sort of realized, like, you know, what's this going to be like the case, and hence we need to give her an 80 cost burst. That's kind of a very generous way of sort of balancing it out. But I do think the developers have made a mistake. What they should have done is they should have allowed her to snapshot, but the moment, let's say, a character's buff expires, like Bennett's buff expires, the snapshotting itself should also be then removed. In other words, like that aspect that's now sort of like baked in or like snapshotted should just be removed then from the damage equation, whereas every other buff should like still stay intact. And I think if they had done that, then Xiangling would have been a much, or like a far better balanced character. But very much like, even like with characters like Sucrose with the cooldown reductions, and characters like Fischl and Oz that allow you to sort of test, like, you know, what are the limits of proccing like additional attacks with reactions and so on. You can clearly see that these characters have so much in their kits precisely because they actually allow you to probe so much in terms of the combat system. And once you've gotten that data from your beta and your alpha testing, you can obviously then go on to sort of design like 5 stars and stuff like around it. But I do think one of the reasons they are so strong is and they've got these bloated kits was primarily also to sort of just test, well, how is this going to work. The other reason I think these characters are so strong is the fact that if you understand how gacha games work, is they want you to in a certain sense like stay invested. They want you to sort of keep on playing, because the more and more you play the game, obviously the more profitable it is for you. So if you have these strong characters that can initially help you in the overworld and help you to progress, then it is far more likely that you as a player will eventually get hooked, especially once the primo gems run dry, and hence you'll be more inclined to spend. Now you might say, well, this is why we have theory crafters, because theory crafters are kind of, generous enough to tell us, you don't need to spend, you can clear the spiral abyss using these meta teams, and you don't need to give any money to the greedy corporate Hoyo. And as noble as that naive line of thinking is, it doesn't sort of equate to the reality that if I give you strong 4-star characters that you can still use to always clear at least one half of the spiral abyss, I've gotten you as a player to keep on playing the game. Yes, you might not spend, you might even claim to be F2P, but if you are someone that keeps on using strong characters to go through the overworld, to go through the spiral abyss, you're playing the game, and the more you play the game, even as an F2P, the more implicitly you're going to contribute to the revenue. If you're someone that plays this Spiral Abyss, you are one of those people that watches like new character trailers, you watch the live streams, you watch the leaks. We know this. Hoyoverse knows this, and they know that that is another passive way for them to generate income from you, and hence it is actually in their best interest to give you these characters, because imagine we didn't have these characters. It would be so difficult for, let's say, new players to actually gain a solid footing. It would feel so unrewarding as an F2P, because why are you going to play a game that is just impossible without just using 5 stars? And I think that is what's so cool about these characters as 4-star characters. They allow everyone to experience the game, but in the same vein, the company can also profit off of it, even if you're an F2P player. And this is why they're so strong, and as a consequence, it then makes sense, well, since we've already given you strong characters, why not let people then sort of curate their experience by paying for the 5 stars, and we'll ensure that the 5 stars are kind of stronger than most of the 4 stars, and all of the subsequent 4 stars need to be niche, because then we can then push your damage ceilings and so on with the new characters that we release to be slightly higher. So you have these generalist characters, but through the use of specialist 4 stars, we can then sort of make your 5 stars even better. I hope that sort of kind of makes sense. But it's kind of really interesting how the game worked out, how Hoyoverse is sort of engineered the game, and whilst I do still think they are a balancing mistake, it is certainly not a marketing mistake. And in fact, I probably argue that if it weren't for these characters, a lot of people would have quit Genshin Impact like long ago. And you might say, well, you don't agree with my reasons that they've released these characters and they're happy with keeping them in the state that they are for profit, but do keep in mind the developers are constantly nerfing enemies. They're constantly nerfing like certain world difficulty levels, like I think world levels 3 to 5 were recently nerfed. Enemies were nerfed like the specters and so on, and they do this because they know players are sort of struggling against them, and they know that players in the early game and so on don't have access to crit rates, so hence having characters like Bennet that can provide you with massive attack buffs is actually kind of useful from a beginner or from a newbie perspective, and hence you have to overtune some of those characters, because if you just look at the natural way the game is balanced through the Genshin Impact damage equation, if you don't do this, then the play experience can actually be really awful. So mathematically it can look good, but practically it has to be a bit unbalanced to make the game seem fun to play. And that's actually going to be my argument. That is why these original characters are so good, and hence why we will not get new 4 stars that are going to be like better, because there's no real need. By the time you have to get materials and items for these new 4 stars, you would have already progressed like significantly throughout the game and so on. So yeah guys, that is my sort of 2 reasons: development and obviously your progression throughout the game, keeping you hooked. That is why we will not get like better 4 stars in the future. Right, let me know what you guys think about this issue, and have a great day. Cheers.